Jimmy Orlando was the NHL's toughest player at the start of the 1940s, but the bad man was forced out of the league not by injuries from his famous furious scraps, nor from his habit of clobbering refs and fans, but rather because the American government accused him of forgery. Rugged rearguard Jimmy Orlando was at the peak of his hockey prowess when forced to leave the NHL in 1943 due to a bureaucratic snafu that cost the swarthy ruffian his career as an immensely popular and effective Detroit Red Wing defenseman. James Vincenzo Orlando grew up in Montreal with 3 brothers and 3 sisters to Canadian-born Italian parents. Orlando excelled at baseball and boxing, but aimed at becoming a pro hockey player. Orlando toiled away at Rochester and Springfield, where he was voted to the International Hockey League All-Star squad, thus catching the eye of Detroit Red Wings coach Jack Adams, who sought young players who'd wade in regardless of enemy or score. Adams instructed Orlando to stay back on defense, and he praised the results. When Orlando suffered a heel injury in 1939, Adams bemoaned his absence.
He was playing brilliantly on defense for a rookie. If he's out, we're going to miss him badly.
World War II began in 1939, and many players were called to military service while others were exempted, sometimes without much explanation. Those included superstar Maurice Richard, whose hockey injuries deemed him unfit for combat. Orlando was exempted because his non-hockey machinist job was considered essential to the war effort. Orlando teamed up with Jack Stewart to form a nasty defense pairing that scared opponents and thrilled Detroit fans. Orlando even got a pass with foes, as his amiable off-ice personality won over enemies. Newspaper reporters and columnists loved Orlando as his vicious play gave them plenty of material, as noted in the following passage.
Look at Orlando. He's trying to take Phil Watson's head off with his stick. It did look as if Orlando was trying to do a bit of work on Watson's head. He had thrust his stick between Watson's teeth and was pulling vigorously. Watson went along like a hooked fish, but finally opened his mouth wide and broke away. Referee Bill Stewart looked at Orlando sternly. 5 minutes in the penalty box for hooking and roughing. Orlando looked crestfallen. What did I do? You put your stick in that man's mouth and pulled. Look at him. He's bleeding now. Nuts! You really bit my stick. Orlando smiled faintly and settled down to service time. He was joined a moment later by Babe Pratt, the Ranger defenseman. Only a minute earlier, Orlando had whacked Pratt over the head with his stick and had been boffed back in return. But they greeted each other like friends, not enemies.
Orlando led the league in penalty minutes for 3 consecutive seasons from 1939 to 1942, ousting 7-time penalty champ Red Horner of Toronto, and fans loved him for it. One young Jimmy Orlando fan, when given a free pass to a game, told an usher,
"Put me near the penalty box. I want to put somewhere where I can see Jimmy Orlando."
Orlando, with his luminescent smile and palsy attitude, became hugely popular in Detroit. He spent his off-seasons in the Motor City and applied for American citizenship, even promising to run for mayor of Detroit one day. "Give me 15 years and I'll do it," he told a reporter in 1941. Orlando battled Chicago's Doug Bentley in a game in Chicago in January 1941, and then walloped a spectator who had been heckling Coach Adams from a seat behind the bench. Orlando got a nod from Adams and KO'd Blackhawks fan Charles Y. Freeman, the son of the CEO of Commonwealth Edison. NHL Commissioner Frank Calder said he'd take no action unless there was a complaint. The Edison CEO said his son was too good a sport to prosecute. The Hawks gave Freeman a pair of season tickets. Orlando followed up the feat by accidentally hitting a linesman in another fight soon after and was again quickly forgiven. One January 1941 article noted that
"The swarthy swatter has pumped plenty of punch and pigment into the once drab Red Wings. Jimmy's a hothead, and so is firebug Phil Watson, the Ranger. Red hot sparks will fly at the Garden."
Orlando was well aware that his feuds were filling stands. "In Chicago, there's barely room for the players to get in. The crowd's terrific, and do I get any of it? Not a dime." Orlando's likeness became iconic after a photo ran in newspapers showing him on the ice with a gaping head wound, the result of a vicious slash from Toronto's Gay Stewart on November 7, 1942, after Orlando had beaten Stewart in a fight earlier in the game. Orlando bore him no ill will and even rushed to Stewart's aid after his rival fell awkwardly to the ice in a later game. On November 25, 1942, Orlando was visiting his hometown in Montreal when Sport Fan magazine awarded him won its trophy for being the NHL's most popular player, but on the same day, RCMP agents met Orlando at the Mount Royal Hotel to question him about details of his military exemption. Orlando's Red Wings, meanwhile, were finally tearing up the league on a season that would end in a Stanley Cup victory, but before that, at the end of March 1943, Orlando received devastating news. U.S. federal authorities charged Orlando with violating the Selective Service Act by failing to notify his board of change of occupation and for falsifying information. A judge freed Orlando on a $2,000 bond to await a grand jury hearing. Orlando had toiled briefly as a machinist before switching to a less physically demanding office job and said he planned to continue his work as machinist at the end of the season. A handwriting expert concluded that a signature on Orlando's documents had been forged, but Orlando pleaded his innocence and said he had been planning to enlist in the Canadian Army at the end of the season.
"I'm no draft dodger. I tried to enlist in the U.S. Army last fall, but was turned down because I'm Canadian."
Orlando and his Red Wings swept the Bruins in 4 straight games, but it would be his last stint in the NHL. Orlando's NHL career spanned 6 seasons in which he scored 6 goals and 25 assists in 199 games with 415 penalty minutes. Orlando narrowly missed playing with legendary Ted Lindsay, who joined the Red Wings the next season, and Gordie Howe, who suited up 3 years later. In April 1944, a Court of Appeals sentenced Orlando to 4 years in prison and a $2,000 fine, but he had already returned to his hometown of Montreal, Canada, rather than fight Uncle Sam. Orlando's NHL career was over, as he could no longer enter the United States without being sent to the clink. Orlando joined the Canadian Army, but was sidelined with injuries from a motorcycle accident. In 1945, he returned to hockey with the newly formed Valleyfield Braves of the 6-team Quebec Senior Hockey League. The league featured stars like Doug Harvey, Floyd Curry, Punch Imlach, Jerry McNeil, Larry Kwan, Toe Blake, and many other future NHL stars. Orlando kept up his rugged style, in one instance causing an opponent to lose a number of teeth. He moved to the Montreal Royals for a couple of seasons before ending his career with a pair of seasons back with Valleyfield before finally retiring. Orlando became a nightclub impresario in 1947 as manager and co-owner of Aldo's on Mountain Street, a stone's throw from where the Bell Center Hockey Arena now sits. Aldo's was a lively place with a mixed crowd that ranged from judges to gangsters. In 1954, Orlando's name appeared alongside prominent journalists, police officers, and politicians on a document seized from the home of gangster Frank Gratula, who listed people he had paid off, mostly in the aim of fixing the Montreal election. The list, only released 2 decades later, came with a description of Orlando as a former hockey player loosely connected with crime in the city. On March 17, 1955, Orlando was attending a game at the Montreal Forum when a fan approached NHL President Clarence Campbell to shake hands. The fan, irritated by a suspension handed out to Habs star Rocket Richard, then hit Campbell in the face. Orlando, who had alertly followed the assailant, stopped the attacker as he was attempting to kick Campbell. A later description claims Orlando hit the assailant so many times that teeth were flying out like chiclets. Campbell declared the game, which the Habs were leading 4-1, a forfeit, leading to the Rocket Richard riot. Montreal newspaper columnists kept the retired Orlando in the news, cheerfully reporting on his charity hockey initiatives, his work as a pro wrestling referee, and they would report it when Orlando shot a moose, hit a hole-in-one, caught a big fish, or took a trip to Mexico. Orlando was still a partner in Aldo's nightclub when he opened the Champs Show Bar on downtown Crescent Street below St. Catherine in late 1958. The bar featured comedian, dancers, striptease acts, including the legendary Lily St. Cyr, supposedly the girlfriend of Orlando, a divorced father of 2. According to gossip columnist turned publicist Norman Olson, the union was a contrivance, as the bombastic stripper was in fact dating married wrestling manager Eddie Quinn, and Orlando was merely playing the role of the decoy. By 1973, both of Orlando's bars had closed, and he spent his time scouting for the Red Wings. In his later years, Orlando still watched hockey and admired fellow Montrealer Mario Lemieux, but he complained the players were overpaid. Orlando married Doris Quinn, daughter of Eddie Quinn, in 1988, and died in his West Island home after a lengthy illness in October 1992. He left his widow and son Ricky and daughter Jamie. Newspaper reporters who had avidly reported on every one of Orlando's activities for decades were largely silent. French-language papers failed to note his passing, with one reporter later misidentifying him as a former Montreal Canadian. Orlando left a legacy of a vicious, nice guy who put cuts and bruises as well as smiles on faces.